Chapter 1: The Birth of a Future King, 1826 to 1840. In the rolling hills of Zululand, where green valleys opened into rivers and the sound of cattle bells carried through the air, a child was born in 1826 who would one day stand as one of the most famous African kings of the 19th century. His name was Cetshwayo Kompande, the son of King Pande and nephew of the legendary Shaka Zulu. The Zulu kingdom was still young when Cetshwayo was born. Shaka had carved out its foundations through both military brilliance and ruthless authority, creating an empire feared across southern Africa. But by the time Cetshwayo came into the world, Shaka was gone, assassinated in 1828. Leadership had passed to Dingain, Shaka's half-brother, and later to Mpande, Cetshwayo's father. The kingdom was powerful, but the throne was never safe. Rivalry and suspicion lingered in every royal household. As a boy, Cetshwayo grew up in this atmosphere of tension and strength. He learned early about the discipline of the Zulu army, the importance of loyalty, and the dangers of betrayal. Tall and broad-shouldered even in youth, he carried himself with a quiet confidence. Unlike some of his brothers, who were quick to seek favor through flattery, Cetshwayo showed patience. He watched and listened, biding his time. His mother, Ngambatsi, was a woman of strong character, and from her Cetshwayo inherited not only his size and presence but also a sense of pride. She raised him to believe he was destined for greatness. Around the fire at night, elders told stories of Shaka's victories and the unstoppable power of the Zulu impi. These stories lit a fire in Cetshwayo's heart. He imagined himself one day standing at the head of thousands, spear in hand, leading his people to glory. By the 1830s, the Zulu kingdom faced new challenges. European settlers, known to the Zulus as the Amabhonu Boers, were pushing northward, clashing with African kingdoms. The British, too, had arrived on the coast, claiming ports and trade routes. Though the Zulus remained strong, whispers spread that times were changing. Firearms, once rare, were becoming more common. The old ways of fighting with spear and shield were being tested. Cetshwayo came of age in this world of uncertainty. At initiation ceremonies, where young men became warriors, he stood out not only for his size but for his ability to command. Other young warriors followed his lead instinctively, impressed by his calm under pressure. He trained hard, mastering the Ikuwa spear and the great cowhide shield that symbolized Zulu identity. By the late 1830s, Cetshwayo had begun to challenge his brothers for influence. His father Mpande, cautious by nature, preferred to avoid direct conflict with the British and Boers. Cetshwayo, however, believed the Zulus could not show weakness. He argued that strength and unity were the only ways to protect the kingdom. In private gatherings, he spoke of Shaka's legacy, reminding his peers that their people had once struck fear into all who dared oppose them. The seeds of rivalry between Cetshwayo and his brothers were already sown. One brother in particular, Biazi, would later become his fiercest opponent. But for now, Cetshwayo was content to build alliances quietly. He befriended commanders in the army, won the respect of older chiefs, and kept his ambitions hidden behind a mask of loyalty to his father. In the villages, stories about him began to spread. Women admired his height and strength, calling him a lion among men. Warriors said he had the spirit of Shaka in his blood. Even elders admitted that the young prince carried himself like a king. The land of Zululand itself seemed to watch him grow. The grasslands where cattle grazed, the rivers where warriors trained, and the mountains that stood as eternal guardians all formed the backdrop of his youth. Every sunrise over the hills reminded him of his duty. One day, he believed the throne would be his, and when that time came, he would need to be ready. By 1840, Cetshwayo was no longer a boy. He was a warrior prince with ambition in his eyes and strength in his arms. Though his path to power would be marked by blood and betrayal, he had already shown the qualities of a leader. The Zulu kingdom waited for the next chapter of its history, and Cetshwayo Kompande was preparing to write it. Chapter 2: Rivalry and the Road to Power, 1840 to 1856. As Cetshwayo grew into manhood, the question of succession within the Zulu royal family became a storm waiting to break. His father, King Mpande, was cautious and deliberate, more concerned with keeping peace than making bold moves. But among his many sons, rivalries ran deep, and none was sharper than that between Sechwale and his younger half-brother Mbiyazi. Mpande favored Mbiyazi, despite the fact that Sechwale was older and far more respected among the warriors. Some said it was because Mbiyazi's mother had stronger ties to certain political factions, while others whispered that Mpande simply feared Sechwale's ambition. Whatever the reason, the king's choice created division within the kingdom. Chiefs, commanders, and even common warriors began to take sides, some swearing loyalty to Sechwale, others pledging support to Mbiyazi. For years, Sechwale played the waiting game. He did not openly defy his father, but he steadily built his base of power. He made alliances with influential chiefs and proved himself in skirmishes against rival groups along Zululand's borders. His reputation grew with every campaign. Warriors who fought under him spoke of his calm leadership, his ability to read the battlefield, and his fearlessness in the thick of combat. The more his reputation rose, the more uneasy Mpande became. The king feared that Sechwale's popularity could one day turn against him. Instead of drawing his sons together, he allowed suspicion and favoritism to widen the rift. By the early 1850s, Zululand was divided into two camps: the supporters of Sechwale, who believed he embodied the true warrior spirit of Shaka, and the followers of Mbiyazi, who relied on the king's backing. This division came to a head in 1856 in what would be remembered as one of the bloodiest moments in Zulu history, the Battle of Nandikusuka. The cause was simple: succession. Sechwale, as the eldest son with overwhelming support among the regiments, demanded recognition as heir. Mpande refused, insisting that Mbiyazi would inherit the throne. The standoff escalated into war. Sechwale gathered his forces, calling upon the loyalty of thousands of warriors. Chiefs and commanders answered his summons, seeing in him the strength needed to guide the Zulu kingdom into the future. They met him with fierce cries of allegiance, shields pounding the ground in rhythm, a living wall of muscle and determination. Sechwale, towering above many of them, raised his spear high and promised victory. Mbiyazi too raised an army, supported by those loyal to Mpande. To strengthen his cause, he sought help from outside the kingdom, drawing support from white settlers along the border. This alliance, however, would later be seen as a weakness, a sign that Mbiyazi was willing to rely on outsiders against his own blood. The two armies clashed near the banks of the Tugela River at Nandikusuka. Tens of thousands filled the field, the air alive with war chants, the earth trembling beneath their feet. Sechwale's regiments advanced with precision, using the famous buffalo horns formation perfected by Shaka. The encircling horns moved fast, while the chest held firm and the reserves waited behind, ready to strike. The battle was brutal and unrelenting. Spears clashed against shields, and cries of the dying echoed across the river plain. Sechwale commanded from a high position, his voice carrying over the chaos, urging his warriors forward with the authority of a born leader. His men obeyed with unwavering loyalty, fighting not just for their prince but for the survival of their vision of the Zulu future. By the end of the day, the field was soaked in blood. Mbiyazi's forces were crushed, and thousands lay dead. The Tugela River ran red as bodies were swept downstream. Mbiyazi himself was killed, ending his claim to the throne in one swift stroke. Though victorious, Sechwale carried the weight of what had happened. Nandikusuka was not a triumph to be celebrated lightly. It had been a battle between brothers, Zulu against Zulu, and its scale of death left scars that would not fade quickly. Still, the outcome was decisive. With Mbiyazi gone, there was no longer any doubt about who would inherit the crown. Sechwale emerged as the undisputed heir to Mpande, though his father remained on the throne. From that day forward, the kingdom looked at Sechwale as its future king. Chiefs and warriors alike knew he had not only the strength of a fighter but also the vision and discipline of a commander. The road to power had been paved with blood, but it secured Sechwale's destiny. The prince who once waited patiently in the shadows was now the clear successor to the throne of the Zulu kingdom. The next chapter of his life would not be about rivalry within his own family, but about defending his people from forces far greater than any brother, forces from across the sea. Chapter 3: The Rise of the Lion, 1856 to 1872. After the bloody fields of Nandikusuka, Sechweo's path to power was clear. His brother Mbiyazi was gone, his rivals scattered, and his father King Pand, though still alive, was growing old and cautious. From 1856 onward, Sechweo stood as the true power in Zululand. Even without the crown on his head, he was already treated as king by warriors, chiefs, and common people alike. The kingdom he inherited in practice was vast and strong. Zulu regiments, organized with the discipline that Shaka had first introduced, remained one of the most formidable fighting forces in southern Africa. Cattle herds flourished in the valleys, providing both wealth and food. Yet Sechweo knew that prosperity could not be taken for granted. Beyond Zululand's borders, the British colony of Natal expanded steadily, while Boer settlers pushed inland. These outsiders watched Zululand with hungry eyes. Sechweo was determined that the Zulus would not appear weak. He reformed the military system, tightening discipline and reinforcing loyalty among the regiments. Young men continued to undergo the rigorous training that defined the Zulu warrior. They learned not only how to wield the short stabbing spear and cowhide shield but also how to march in perfect formation, to attack with speed and precision, and to obey commands without hesitation. When Sechweo spoke to his warriors, he did so with both authority and inspiration. Tall, broad, and commanding, he carried himself with the dignity of a lion. His deep voice rolled over the crowds like thunder. He reminded them of Shaka's glory, of the victories that had made the Zulu name feared. But he also spoke of the challenges to come. The British and Boers, he warned, would not stop at the rivers or mountains. They would come for the land, the cattle, and the people themselves. Only unity and strength could preserve the Zulu way of life. While his father remained on the throne, Sechweo held back from outright claiming kingship. Mpand, though weak and hesitant, was still king, and Sechweo did not wish to be seen as a usurper. Instead, he ruled through influence. Chiefs came to him for judgment in disputes. Commanders sought his approval before leading raids or defending the borders. When warriors performed their war dances, they looked not at Mpand but at Sechweo. The old king's authority faded into ceremony, while Sechweo's power grew with each passing year. Not all challenges came from outside. Within Zululand, rival factions still tried to test him. Some feared that Sechweo's ambition would bring war with the British, and they sought to restrain his influence. Others, jealous of his power, whispered against him. Sechweo responded not with rashness but with patience. He knew when to act firmly and when to wait. Those who stood openly against him were quickly crushed, while those who bent to his will were rewarded with favor. His reputation spread far beyond the borders of Zululand. Travelers and traders carried stories of the towering Zulu prince who commanded absolute loyalty. In Natal, British officials kept a wary eye on him, recognizing his authority even before he wore the crown. Some tried to undermine him by sending missionaries and envoys to win over chiefs, but Sechweo's influence remained too strong. In 1872, the inevitable happened. King Pan died after years of declining health, and the mantle of leadership passed fully to Sechweo. The transition was smooth, for no one doubted who the rightful king was. His coronation, though not in the European sense, was marked by traditional Zulu ceremonies. Regiments gathered in vast numbers, performing dances that shook the earth. Chiefs swore loyalty, cattle were slaughtered in sacrifice, and the people celebrated the rise of their new ruler. Sechweo stood before them in full regalia, the tall isokoko headring of a married man, the leopard skin cloak that marked his royal status, and the great cowhide shield in his hand. He raised his spear and declared his promise to defend Zululand. The cheers of tens of thousands answered him, rolling like waves across the land. Now king in name as well as in power, Sechweo set his eyes on the future. His reign began with a vision of strength and independence. He expanded the regimental system, ensuring that the Zulu army was as large and disciplined as possible. He reinforced the traditional customs that bound his people together, while also watching closely the moves of the British and Boers. The Lion of Zululand had risen. For years he had waited, planned, and fought for this moment. Now he was king, and his people looked to him as the shield of their nation. Yet even as the celebrations filled the air, the shadow of conflict loomed on the horizon. The British Empire was growing restless, and Zululand's independence would soon be tested as never before. Chapter 4: Shadows of Empire, 1872 to 1878. When Cetshwayo Kampan took the throne in 1872, the Zulu kingdom stood proud and united. His warriors filled the valleys with their chants, the cattle herds flourished, and the people believed their new king would guard them against all threats. Yet beyond Zululand's borders, forces were moving that would soon cast a long shadow over his reign. The British Empire had grown restless. From their base in Natal, colonial officials and military commanders looked north toward Zululand with increasing interest. They saw fertile land for farming, strategic territory for expansion, and a powerful African kingdom that refused to bow to European authority. To men like Sir Henry Bartle Frere, the British High Commissioner in Southern Africa, Zululand was not simply a neighbor. It was an obstacle to imperial plans. Cetshwayo understood this clearly. He was no stranger to the ambitions of the British and the Boers. As a prince, he had watched them push deeper into the continent, seizing land from weaker kingdoms and tribes. Now, as king, he resolved that Zululand would not be broken so easily. His first years as ruler were marked by balance. He strengthened the Zulu army, ensuring that every regiment remained disciplined and ready for war. At the same time, he worked to maintain peace with Natal, sending messages of goodwill and assuring British officials that he wanted only stability. He did not seek unnecessary conflict, but he made it clear that Zululand would defend itself if attacked. Inside his kingdom, Cetshwayo upheld tradition while also showing moments of flexibility. He enforced the strict regimental system inherited from Shaka, demanding obedience and unity. Young men continued to live in military barracks, trained constantly in the art of war. Yet he also allowed missionaries limited access to his lands, recognizing that they could serve as bridges between his kingdom and the outside world. Still, mistrust lingered on both sides of the Tugela River. British officials often misrepresented Cetshwayo as a tyrant, painting him as a savage ruler who threatened regional peace. They feared his large army, which numbered in the tens of thousands, and exaggerated stories of brutality within Zululand. These tales served a purpose: to justify future intervention. Meanwhile, Cetshwayo faced pressure within his own borders. Some chiefs questioned whether he could hold the kingdom together in the face of European expansion. Others feared that his determination to resist the British might bring ruin upon them all. Cetshwayo responded with firmness. He reminded his people that their independence was not a gift from outsiders but the result of blood and sacrifice. If they abandoned strength now, he argued, they would lose everything. By the mid-1870s, tensions between Zululand and the British colony of Natal had grown sharper. Disputes over cattle thefts, border lines, and minor raids were exaggerated into political crises. British settlers complained that Zululand was a constant threat, even though Cetshwayo had forbidden attacks across the border. Each small incident was used as evidence that the Zulu king was uncontrollable. Behind these accusations lay a greater plan. The British sought to unite southern Africa under their control, bringing together the colonies, Boer republics, and African kingdoms into a single confederation. For this plan to succeed, Zululand could not remain independent. Cetshwayo's kingdom stood in the way of empire, and officials like Bartle Frere began preparing the ground for war. Cetshwayo, for his part, tried to avoid direct confrontation. He sent envoys to the British, stressing his desire for peace. He asked only that Zululand be left alone, free to govern its own affairs. But his words fell on deaf ears. The British were not looking for peace, they were looking for an excuse. By 1878, the storm was close. British newspapers spoke of Zululand as a menace. colonial officials compiled lists of supposed Zulu crimes. Every move was designed to build a case for invasion. At the same time, Sechweo tightened his defenses, knowing that war could not be avoided forever. He reminded his warriors of their duty, drilled them in the buffalo horns formation, and kept the spirit of resistance alive. The king stood tall in these years, a symbol of determination in the face of empire. He knew that the British had guns, cannons, and endless supplies, but he also knew the strength of his people and the courage of his warriors. "I am the shield of Zululand," he told his followers, and they believed him. The shadows of empire lengthened with each passing season. The clash between the Zulu kingdom and the British Empire was no longer a question of if, but when. Zululand's greatest test was about to begin, and Sechweo prepared himself to lead his nation through the fire. Chapter 5: The Road to War, 1878 to 1879. By the late 1870s, the fragile balance between the Zulu kingdom and the British Empire had collapsed. For years, Sechweo had tried to walk a careful line, strengthening his nation while avoiding open conflict, but the British had already set their sights on Zululand. They needed only the right excuse to strike. That excuse came in 1878. Sir Henry Bartlefrere, the British High Commissioner, was determined to bring all of southern Africa under imperial control. He viewed the Zulu army, with its tens of thousands of disciplined warriors, as a threat to the confederation he wanted to build. In his mind, Sechweo's independence was intolerable. The spark was a border dispute. Along the frontier between Natal and Zululand, small incidents, cattle thefts, arguments over grazing land, and even minor raids, were magnified into crises. British officials accused the Zulus of aggression, though many of these claims were exaggerated or false. Frere seized upon these disputes as justification for action. In December 1878, Frere sent an ultimatum to Sechweo. It was a document that no independent king could accept. Among its demands were that the Zulu army be disbanded, that the regimental system be dismantled, and that British officials gain a say in Zulu affairs. To comply would have been to surrender the very heart of Zulu identity. Sechweo listened to the ultimatum with a heavy heart. He had no desire for war. He understood the might of the British Empire, their guns, cannons, and endless supplies. But to accept these terms would be to strip Zululand of its sovereignty. He told his advisers that he wished for peace, but not peace at the cost of humiliation. When the British deadline expired in January 1879, Zululand braced for invasion. Sechweo called his regiments to readiness, summoning warriors from across the kingdom. Villages echoed with the sound of shields pounding the earth, of war songs rising into the air. Young men painted their faces, tightened their loincloths, and sharpened their spears. The king reminded them that they fought not for conquest but for survival. Unlike the British, who marched with rifles and artillery, the Zulu army still relied on the traditional weapons of spear and shield. Yet they had something the British did not: discipline, numbers, and unity. Sechweo's generals prepared to use the time-tested buffalo horns formation, designed to surround and overwhelm the enemy. Warriors moved like flowing water, swift and precise, obeying commands with perfect coordination. As January turned to war, the British crossed the Tugela River in 3 separate columns, invading Zululand from different directions. Their commanders believed the campaign would be quick and decisive. They expected the Zulus to break at the sight of modern firepower. What they did not understand was the depth of Zulu resolve. Sechweo gave strict orders to his regiments. He did not want reckless attacks that might expose his people to needless slaughter. He urged patience and strategy. His goal was to strike hard at the right moment, to show the British that Zululand could not be conquered easily. "Defend your land," he told his commanders, "but do not chase war where it is not needed." Behind his calm words, though, Sechweo knew the stakes. If his kingdom fell, it would not only mean the loss of territory but also the destruction of the Zulu way of life. His warriors fought with spears, but they carried more than weapons into battle. They carried the spirit of their ancestors, the memory of Shaka, and the pride of generations. As the first British forces moved deeper into Zululand, the king gathered his counselors at Ondini, his royal homestead. They sat around the great fires, discussing strategy. Messengers arrived with reports of British movements, and scouts returned with news of enemy camps. Sechweo listened carefully, his face stern but composed. He knew that the time had come for the Zulu kingdom to meet its greatest challenge. The road to war had been forced upon him. He had not sought it, yet it was at his gates. His people looked to him for leadership, and he would not fail them. Soon, the green hills of Zululand would echo not with cattle bells and laughter, but with the clash of battle and the cries of warriors. In the weeks ahead, history would be made. The Zulu kingdom, armed with shields and spears, would face the most powerful empire on earth. And at the center of it all stood Sechweo Compand, the Lion of Zululand, ready to defend his nation's honor at any cost. Chapter 6: The Battle of Isandlwana, 1879. On the morning of January 22, 1879, the green hills of Zululand stood silent under a rising sun. In the valley below the towering peak of Isandlwana, the British camp stirred to life. Rows of white tents stretched across the plain, guarded by red-coated soldiers who believed themselves secure. They carried rifles, bayonets, and cannons, convinced that no African force could challenge them. Yet hidden beyond the hills, the Zulu army gathered, silent and waiting. Sechweo had not ordered an invasion of Natal. He had given strict instructions to fight only in defense, but now the defense of Zululand had arrived. More than 20,000 Zulu warriors, organized into regiments, moved like shadows through the grasslands. Their bodies gleamed with sweat, their cowhide shields glistened in the light, and their short, stabbing spears were ready. They had been waiting for the right moment, and that moment had come. The British commander, Lord Chelmsford, had divided his forces. Believing the Zulus to be scattered, he had marched out with half his army in search of them, leaving around 1,700 men in the camp at Isandlwana. It was a fatal mistake. The Zulus, guided by their generals, prepared to strike at the exposed camp with the full force of their traditional formation. The horns of the buffalo spread wide, curling around to encircle the camp. The chest moved forward in steady waves, while the loins, the reserves, waited behind. It was the strategy perfected under Shaka and now unleashed under Sechweo's reign. From a distance, the Zulu regiments appeared like a vast black tide sweeping across the plain. The first shots cracked through the air as British sentries fired. The sound of rifles soon filled the valley, and smoke drifted across the tents. The Zulus pressed forward, shields locked, spears raised. Many fell under the storm of bullets, but the others did not falter. With each step, they closed the distance, the earth shaking beneath their advance. Inside the camp, British officers shouted orders, forming firing lines and loading their Martini Henry rifles as quickly as possible. Their fire tore through the Zulu ranks, cutting down dozens at a time. Yet the warriors surged on, chanting war songs, their voices merging into a thunderous roar. Their discipline never broke. They obeyed their commanders, striking in perfect unison. When the Zulus reached the British lines, the battle turned into a storm of chaos. Spears clashed against bayonets, shields battered rifles aside, and the red-coated soldiers found themselves overwhelmed. The Zulus fought with relentless fury, driving into the heart of the camp. Men fell on both sides, but the sheer weight of numbers carried the Zulus forward. Within hours, the camp at Isandlwana was a scene of devastation. The white tents were torn apart, wagons overturned, and the ground littered with the fallen. Nearly the entire British force was wiped out, over 1,000 soldiers killed in a single day. It was a disaster unlike anything the British Empire had experienced in Africa. News of the victory spread like wildfire through Zululand. Villages erupted in celebration, warriors danced in triumph, and the name of Sechweo was praised across the land. The Zulu king had not been present at the battlefield, but his leadership and preparation had made the victory possible. For the first time, an African army had destroyed a modern European force in open combat. Yet Sechweo did not rejoice without caution. He knew what the British response would be. Isandlwana was a humiliation the Empire could not ignore. He feared that the victory, as great as it was, would only bring more soldiers, more guns, and greater determination from his enemies. Indeed, while the Zulu warriors celebrated, British commanders were already regrouping. Reinforcements were called from across the colonies, and ships sailed from England carrying fresh troops. The Empire would not let the loss at Isandlwana stand. For Sechweo, the victory was both a moment of pride and a heavy burden. His warriors had proved their strength to the world, but in doing so, they had unleashed the full fury of an empire. The battle at Isandlwana marked the high point of Zulu power, but also the beginning of the kingdom's greatest trial. The lion of Zululand had roared, and the world had heard. Now the question was whether Zululand could withstand the storm that was sure to follow. Chapter 7: Rorke's Drift and the British Response, 1879. The smoke of Isandlwana had barely cleared when the next clash unfolded at a small mission station called Rorke's Drift. While the Zulus celebrated their stunning victory, a smaller regiment, driven by momentum, advanced toward this outpost on the border with Natal. It was here, on the night of January 22, 1879, that the British would claw back a measure of pride. Rorke's Drift was little more than a cluster of buildings, a church-turned-storehouse, a hospital, and a few wagons. Defended by barely 150 British soldiers, it seemed an easy target for thousands of Zulu warriors. The defenders knew that if the Zulu army broke through, nothing would stop them from sweeping deeper into Natal. For the British soldiers, retreat was impossible. They chose to stand and fight. The Zulu regiments arrived as the sun dipped behind the hills. War cries pierced the air as shields flashed in the firelight. The defenders stacked mail-eye bags and biscuit boxes into makeshift barricades, turning the mission into a fortress. As the first wave of Zulus charged, rifles cracked in rapid bursts. The attackers fell, but more pressed forward, leaping over the barricades and forcing the fight into brutal hand-to-hand combat. Through the night, the battle raged. The Zulus fought with incredible bravery, hurling themselves again and again at the defenses. Spears thrust through the smoke, and shields smashed against bayonets. The British, fighting for survival, fired until their rifles glowed hot, reloaded in frantic rhythm, and fought in the narrow passageways of the hospital as flames consumed its walls. By dawn, the ground was covered with the bodies of Zulu warriors who had given everything in the assault. Exhausted and bloodied, the British still held their ground. Over 350 Zulus lay dead around the mission. Rorke's Drift became a rallying cry for the Empire, a story of courage and survival told in the same breath as the disaster at Isandlwana. For Sechweo, the outcome was bittersweet. On one hand, his warriors had shown again their fearlessness. On the other, the heavy losses at Rorke's Drift weakened his forces, and the British used the defense as propaganda to balance their humiliation. London celebrated the stand of its soldiers, and the story of Rorke's Drift spread across newspapers, painting the British not as victims but as heroes. Meanwhile, reinforcements poured into southern Africa. Thousands of fresh troops, armed with rifles, artillery, and even Gatling guns, prepared to march into Zululand. The Empire's pride demanded revenge, and Sechweo knew the war had shifted into a new phase. Inside Zululand, the king remained steady. He sent messages to his regiments, reminding them of their victory at Isandlwana and urging them to hold firm. Yet privately he wrestled with doubt. The British were gathering in numbers that dwarfed anything the Zulus had faced before. His people could not match the Empire's endless supply of men and weapons. The king hoped for a negotiated peace, but the British made no such offers. Instead, the British advanced in force. Their commanders studied the mistakes of Isandlwana, learning to keep their columns tightly defended and their supply lines strong. They moved cautiously, covering each step with rifle volleys and cannon fire. Where once they had underestimated the Zulu, they now treated them as a serious enemy. As the months dragged on, Zululand burned. Villages were torched, cattle seized, and fields trampled under the boots of soldiers. Zulu regiments fought back fiercely in ambushes and skirmishes, but the pressure mounted. For every small victory, the cost was high, and the Empire's strength kept growing. The aftermath of Rorke's Drift revealed a harsh truth: the Zulus could win battles, but the British had the resources to win wars. Cetewayo faced the greatest challenge of his reign. He had to hold his kingdom together, keep his warriors inspired, and somehow find a way to resist the tide of empire that now surged against him. The Lion of Zululand still stood, but the storm had only begun. Ahead lay the decisive clash that would determine the fate of his kingdom, the final battle at Ulundi. Chapter 8: The Fall of Ulundi, 1879. By mid-1879, the war had reached its climax. After months of fighting, the British army pushed deeper into Zululand, their numbers swollen with reinforcements from across the empire. Where once the red-coated soldiers marched uncertainly, now they advanced with confidence, protected by artillery, cavalry, and the deadly power of the Gatling gun. Villages burned in their wake, and the people of Zululand felt the weight of invasion like never before. Cetewayo watched the unfolding storm with growing despair. He had hoped that the victory at Isandlwana might lead to negotiations, that the British would recognize the strength and independence of the Zulu kingdom. Instead, the empire had doubled its resolve. Now they came not merely to punish but to destroy. The Zulu king understood that his throne, his people, and his way of life were all at stake. The final confrontation was inevitable. The British targeted Ulundi, the royal capital, as the symbol of Zulu power. Capturing it meant breaking the heart of the kingdom. Cetewayo called his regiments together for one last stand. Tens of thousands of warriors gathered, their shields polished, their spears sharp, their voices rising in war chants that echoed across the grasslands. Though weary from months of conflict, they came with fierce determination, ready to defend their king and homeland. On July 4, 1879, the two armies faced each other on the plain near Ulundi. The morning air was heavy with tension. The British formed a massive square, their soldiers arranged on all four sides, rifles leveled outward. Inside the square, artillery and cavalry stood ready. It was a formation designed to resist attack from every direction, a lesson learned from their losses earlier in the war. The Zulu army, nearly 20,000 strong, advanced with courage and discipline. They moved in waves, horns of the buffalo formation curling around the square, just as they had done at Isandlwana. The warriors charged with thunder in their feet, chanting songs of valor, their shields raised high. Spears glittered in the sun as the living tide surged forward. Then came the roar of British firepower. Rifles cracked in relentless volleys, tearing holes in the advancing ranks. Cannon shells exploded among the warriors, scattering men and shields alike. And when the Gatling guns opened fire, their spinning barrels unleashed streams of bullets that cut down rows of Zulus in seconds. Still, the warriors pressed forward, shouting defiantly, leaping over the fallen, hurling themselves at the wall of steel and smoke. Some reached the British lines, clashing with bayonets in moments of brutal hand-to-hand combat. But each assault was thrown back, crushed under the weight of disciplined fire. For hours, the Zulu army hurled itself against the square, only to be broken again and again. The plain became a scene of tragedy. Bodies covered the ground, drums fell silent, and the chants of the warriors faded under the thunder of guns. As the sun climbed high, the Zulu regiments began to falter. The courage of the warriors had not failed, but no courage could withstand such devastating firepower. By midday, the battle was over. The Zulu army was shattered, their formation scattered across the plain. Thousands lay dead or wounded, and the survivors retreated into the hills. Ulundi itself was captured and burned, its huts reduced to ash, its royal enclosures destroyed. The heart of the Zulu kingdom had been struck down. For Cetewayo, the defeat was devastating. He had led his people with pride and dignity, but now his kingdom lay in ruins. The empire's soldiers marched unchallenged through the land, and the once mighty regiments were broken. Yet even in defeat, Cetewayo carried himself with the dignity of a king. He mourned his warriors, his capital, and the way of life that had endured for generations, but he refused to bow in spirit. The fall of Ulundi marked the end of the Zulu kingdom's independence. The war that had begun with such triumph at Isandlwana now closed with tragedy. Zululand was left at the mercy of the empire, and its people faced a future shaped not by their own king but by foreign rule. Still, the memory of Ulundi lived on. The courage of the Zulu warriors, their discipline, and their devotion to their king ensured that their story would never be forgotten. The battle was a defeat, but it was also a testament to the strength of a people who had dared to stand against one of the greatest empires in history. Chapter 9: The Capture and Exile of Sechwale, 1879–1883. The smoke of Ulundi lingered long after the battle was lost. For the Zulu people, the fields where their warriors had fallen became sacred ground, a reminder of their courage and sacrifice. For Sechwale Compand, the defeat marked the beginning of a harsh new chapter. He was no longer simply a king defending his land, he was now a hunted leader in a land occupied by foreign soldiers. The British wasted no time in dismantling the kingdom. Zululand was divided into smaller chiefdoms, each governed by leaders chosen by the colonial authorities. This was designed to weaken Zulu unity and prevent another uprising. Warriors who had once fought together under one king were now scattered, their regiments broken apart. The proud kingdom that Shaka had built and Sechwale had defended was fractured into pieces. Sechwale himself became a symbol of resistance. The British knew that as long as he remained free, the people would still rally to him. Orders were given to track him down. For weeks, the Zulu king moved between hidden places, protected by loyal followers who risked everything to shield him. His heart was heavy. He had lost his capital, his army was shattered, and his people suffered under foreign rule, yet he remained determined not to surrender without dignity. Eventually, the inevitable came. In August 1879, British troops captured Sechwale. Surrounded and outnumbered, he could not escape. The once proud king, who had commanded tens of thousands of warriors, was led away in chains. For many Zulus, it was a moment of deep sorrow. They wept as their king was taken, for his capture symbolized not just the loss of a man but the loss of their independence. The British treated him with a mixture of caution and respect. They recognized his stature, not only among his people but across southern Africa. Rather than execute him, they chose exile. First, he was taken to the Cape, then transported across the sea to England itself. It was there, in a land far from Zululand, that Sechwale found himself walking the streets of London. For the British public, the sight of the Zulu king was extraordinary. Newspapers printed his image, artists sketched his likeness, and crowds gathered to see the man who had once humbled the empire at Isandlwana. Dressed in European clothes but carrying himself with the dignity of a monarch, Sechwale surprised many with his calm intelligence and sharp mind. He was no savage warlord, as some had imagined, but a thoughtful leader who spoke of peace, justice, and the right of his people to live free. In London, Sechwale appealed to the authorities for the restoration of his throne. He explained that he had never sought war, only to defend his kingdom from invasion. He asked not for vengeance but for fairness, for the chance to lead his people once again. His words reached sympathetic ears. Some British officials, and even members of the public, believed that the king had been wronged. Still, politics moved slowly. Years passed as debates continued over Zululand's future. Meanwhile, back home, the land suffered. Without a central authority, rival chiefs quarreled and fought, creating instability. The division imposed by the British led to chaos, and many began to long for the return of the king who had once united them. By 1883, the British relented. They allowed Sechwale to return to Zululand, though his power was far weaker than before. He was restored not as the king of all Zululand, but only as ruler of a portion. The empire had no intention of allowing him to rebuild the strength of his former kingdom. Even so, for the Zulu people, his return was a moment of hope. After years of exile, the lion had come home. But peace was fragile. Sechwale returned to a kingdom divided, his authority challenged not only by the colonial authorities but also by rival chiefs who sought power for themselves. The exile had ended, but the struggle for Zululand's future was far from over. By 1883, the British relented. They allowed Sechweo to return to Zululand, though his power was far weaker than before. He was restored not as the king of all Zululand, but only as ruler of a portion. The empire had no intention of allowing him to rebuild the strength of his former kingdom. Even so, for the Zulu people, his return was a moment of hope. After years of exile, the lion had come home. But peace was fragile. Sechweo returned to a kingdom divided, his authority challenged not only by the colonial authorities but also by rival chiefs who sought power for themselves. The exile had ended, but the struggle for Zululand's future was far from over. Chapter 10: The Last Days of Sechweo, 1883 to 1884. When Sechweo returned to Zululand in 1883, the air was thick with tension. His people rejoiced to see him again, singing the songs of old, welcoming their king with tears and dances. For them, his presence brought a spark of unity and pride. Yet the kingdom he had once commanded with such strength was no longer whole. The British had carved it into fragments, handing power to rival chiefs who owed loyalty to the empire, not to the Zulu throne. Sechweo settled at a royal kraal near Ulundi, where he tried to re-establish order. He sent messages to the scattered chiefs, urging them to lay aside their quarrels and remember the unity that had once made Zululand strong. But his words carried less weight than before. Years of war, division, and exile had changed the balance of power. The regiments that had once moved as one under his command were now broken into factions. One of the fiercest rivals was Zibebu Kamafitha, a chief backed by the British and determined to weaken Sechweo's influence. Tensions boiled into violence. In 1883, Zibebu launched an attack on Sechweo's stronghold. The battle was fierce and bloody. Sechweo's supporters fought bravely, but the odds were stacked against them. The king's forces were routed, and his homestead was burned. Once again, Sechweo was forced to flee, his authority crumbling in the face of betrayal and division. The defeat broke him in ways the British never could. At Isanluana, he had seen victory. At Ulundi, he had endured the crushing weight of empire. But now he faced defeat at the hands of his own people, divided by the very policies the British had put in place to dismantle Zulu unity. For a king who had once commanded the loyalty of tens of thousands, the betrayal was bitter. After the attack, Sechweo lived in hiding, wounded in both body and spirit. Reports say he was injured during the fighting, and his health began to decline rapidly. By early 1884, he was gravely ill. On February 8, 1884, Sechweo Kampand, the last great king of an independent Zulu kingdom, passed away. He was only 58 years old. The news of his death spread quickly through Zululand. His people mourned deeply, for though his final years were marked by defeat and division, he had carried the dignity of a king to the very end. They remembered the man who had stood against the might of the British Empire, who had brought them victory at Isanluana, and who had fought tirelessly to preserve their independence. The British, too, noted his passing. In London, officials and newspapers acknowledged him as a formidable leader, a man of courage and intelligence who had earned respect even from his enemies. To them, his death marked the close of a turbulent chapter in their African campaigns. Sechweo's legacy lived on in the spirit of his people. Though Zululand was never again the powerful, united kingdom it had been under Shaka or Sechweo, the memory of their resistance inspired future generations. The story of Isanluana, of warriors who stood firm against one of the greatest empires in history, became part of Zulu pride and identity. In the end, Sechweo Kampand was more than just a king. He was a symbol of resilience, a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming power, dignity and courage could not be erased. His life was marked by triumph and tragedy, by victories that shook an empire and by defeats that broke a kingdom. Yet through it all, he remained the Lion of Zululand, remembered not for how he fell but for how he stood.